This isn't just a list of fast cars. This is the story of the year Detroit learned how to build a race car and sell it like a family sedan. Race engines with vague horsepower ratings, dealer-installed racing parts shipped separately in the trunk, and one legendary engine that only 142 people ever managed to actually order. Nobody was supposed to be racing in 1961. Almost everybody was. In 1961, America's automakers had a secret, and they were terrible at keeping it. 4 years earlier, the industry had signed on to something called the AMA ban, a quiet, gentleman's agreement between the major manufacturers to stop officially sponsoring racing and stop advertising raw horsepower. On paper, it was supposed to slow the horsepower war down. In practice, it just pushed the war underground. By 1961, some of the fastest engines Detroit had ever built were being sold without fanfare, shipped in unmarked boxes, installed by dealers instead of factories, and rated with horsepower numbers that everyone in the industry knew were quietly, deliberately wrong. By the end of this countdown, you'll know exactly which 10 American cars earned the right to be called the fastest of 1961, and why so many of them were built to be just a little bit hidden. The Automobile Manufacturers Association ban on factory-supported racing had technically been in place since 1957, following a string of high-profile crashes at Indianapolis and Le Mans. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had all publicly agreed to stop advertising speed and stop sponsoring race teams directly. By 1961, that agreement had become mostly theater. Pontiac was quietly building race-only engines and selling them over the counter to qualified drivers. Ford was shipping high-performance carburetor kits and car trunks for dealers to install after the sale, keeping the factory's hands technically clean. Chevrolet introduced its most powerful engine yet, the 409, with almost no advertising at all, only for it to become a cultural phenomenon anyway, once a rock and roll band from California got hold of the story. Meanwhile, one of Detroit's oldest brands, DeSoto, was living out its final days so quietly that most of the buying public barely noticed it was gone. Let's start the countdown. Number 10 marks the end of an era at Mercury and the quiet arrival of a new one. For 1961, Mercury abandoned its own MEL big block engine family entirely and adopted Ford's FE Series V8s across the full-size lineup, matching the same 390 cubic inch engine found in the Ford Galaxy. In standard Monterey form, the 390 was rated at a modest 300 horsepower with a single 4-barrel carburetor. Respectable, but a clear step down from the 400 horsepower Super Marauder Mercury had briefly built just 3 years earlier. It's a quiet, almost invisible transition in Mercury's history, but an important one. By sharing engines directly with Ford, Mercury gave up some of its independent identity, folding its performance image into the corporate FE family, the same family that would soon carry Ford's most famous racing engines, including the one you'll hear about later in this countdown. Number 9 keeps Buick's Wildcat 401 running largely unchanged into a third model year. The 1961 Invicta carried forward the same 401 cubic inch nail-head V8 introduced in 1959, factory rated at 325 horsepower at 4,400 RPM with a single 4-barrel carburetor, backed by Buick's turbine drive automatic transmission. Buick made only modest styling updates for 1961, keeping its performance formula essentially untouched while its GM stablemates chased more exotic induction systems. It's a car that didn't need to hide anything. Buick's nailhead was already well established, already respected, and already fast enough to compete without any dramatic new engineering. Sometimes, the safest way through a horsepower war is simply to keep building the engine that already works. Number 8 brings back Cadillac's triple carburetor flagship and what would turn out to be its final year with tri-power. The 1961 Eldorado again came standard with Cadillac's 390 cubic inch V8, fitted with 3 2-barrel Rochester carburetors, producing approximately 345 horsepower. Genuinely serious output for a full-size luxury convertible. Cadillac would drop the tri-power option after this model year, moving to a single four-barrel setup across the board starting in 1962. That makes the 1961 Eldorado something of a quiet landmark, the last of Cadillac's triple-carburetor performance flagships from the golden age of horsepower war, built in relatively small numbers before the division shifted its performance emphasis elsewhere for the rest of the decade. Number 7 brings Dodge's cross-ram technology into its second model year, with the AMA band's chilling effect starting to show. The 1961 Polara continued to offer the 383 cubic inch V8 with Chrysler's cross-ram induction system, factory rated at roughly 330 horsepower with dual four-barrel carburetors on those distinctive 30-inch tuned intake runners. It was, on paper, nearly identical to the 1960 D500 package, but Dodge marketed it with noticeably less fanfare than the year before, part of a broader industry-wide pullback in overt performance advertising following renewed pressure to honor the AMA agreement. The engineering hadn't gotten any less impressive. The marketing around it had simply gotten quieter, a pattern that would repeat itself across almost every manufacturer on this list in 1961. Number 6 keeps Plymouth's sonoramic Commando running for a second straight year, largely unchanged and still genuinely quick. The 1961 Fury carried forward the 383 cubic inch cross-ram V8 introduced in 1960, factory rated at approximately 330 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. Plymouth styling took another swing for 1961, a partial reskin below the belt line that softens some of the tail fin excess of the previous few years, part of the industry-wide retreat from Virgil Exner's boldest fin designs. Underneath that toned-down styling, though, the sonoramic engine remained one of the most capable full-size performance packages in America, quietly carrying Chrysler's cross-ram technology into a second year without missing a step. Number 5 introduces a brand new Oldsmobile nameplate, built specifically to chase the personal luxury market Ford had opened up with the Thunderbird. Debuting at mid-year as a convertible based on the Super 88, the Starfire came standard with a high-compression version of Oldsmobile's 394 cubic inch Rocket V8, factory rated at 330 horsepower, the most powerful rocket engine Oldsmobile had built up to that point. It was also the first full-size American production car to feature a center-floor console with a floor-mounted shifter for its automatic transmission, a genuinely new idea for 1961. Loaded with leather bucket seats, power everything, and a distinctive brushed aluminum lower body panel, the Starfire wasn't marketed as a race car, it was marketed as a status symbol that happened to be fast. But underneath the luxury trim sat Oldsmobile's most powerful engine yet, proof that performance and prestige weren't mutually exclusive in 1961. Number 4 is where this list starts to lean into its title, because this car's fastest engine wasn't something you could simply order from the factory, you had to know to ask for it. Ford's all-new 390 cubic inch FE-V8 debuted for 1961 in the fastback Starliner, available in 3 distinct states of tune: a base 300 horsepower 4-barrel, a high-performance 375 horsepower solid lifter version nicknamed the Thunderbird Special, and a triple carburetor option, 3 Holley 2-barrels on an aluminum intake, factory rated at 401 horsepower. Here's the part that earns this car its place on this list. That triple carburetor setup wasn't installed at the factory at all. Ford shipped the parts in a box in the car's trunk to be bolted on by the dealer or the buyer after the sale, a deliberate workaround that let Ford's factory paperwork stay technically clean of any 401 horsepower production claim, while the horsepower reached the street anyway. CarCraft magazine called it the hottest street engine of 1961. Barely 100 4-speed versions were ever built, making a genuine 401 horsepower Starliner one of the rarest and most quietly potent Fords of the entire era. Number 3 is the car that would eventually become a rock and roll song, but almost nobody heard about it when it was actually new. In December of 1960, Chevrolet quietly introduced the Impala Supersport option package, and shortly after, an entirely new engine to go with it, The 409 cubic inch big block, a bored and stroked evolution of the outgoing 348, factory rated at 360 horsepower and a genuinely massive 409 pound-feet of torque. Chevrolet built 491,000 Impalas for the 1961 model year. Only 453 of them received the Supersport package, and of those, only 142, barely a rounding error in Chevrolet's total production, actually left the factory with a 409 under the hood. It was, quite literally, one of the best hidden cars in America in 1961. Word spread slowly through drag strips and street corners, not through Chevrolet's advertising department, which barely mentioned the engine at all. It would take until the following summer when a young band called the Beach Boys released a song called 409 for the rest of America to find out what a tiny handful of buyers had already discovered: that this quiet, unassuming family car was hiding one of the fastest engines Detroit had ever built. Not every story from 1961 involved a car that was fast. This one involved a brand that barely existed at all, and it might be the most literal example of Detroit trying to hide something on this entire list. Chrysler Corporation officially announced the end of the DeSoto brand on November 30th, 1960, but a small handful of 1961 DeSoto models had already reached dealer lots before that announcement, built just long enough to use up leftover 1961 trim and parts. Production of the 1961 DeSoto lasted a grand total of 47 days from the introduction of the model year, before Chrysler pulled the plug entirely. Fewer than 100 1961 DeSotos are believed to have been built in total, making them some of the rarest American production cars of the entire decade. Not because they were exotic or expensive, but because Chrysler Corporation genuinely didn't want anyone to notice they existed. A once proud brand, quietly erased in less than 2 months, is as close as this whole horsepower war ever came to something actually being hidden completely. Number 2 brings the AMA band's strangest workaround of the entire era: an engine Pontiac built specifically for racing, then quietly sold to the public anyway. Late in the 1961 model year, just before Labor Day weekend, Pontiac announced a new engine option for qualified drivers only: the 421 cubic inch Super Duty V8, available on the Cadillac or Ventura two-door body styles. Officially, Pontiac rated the engine at just 373 horsepower with dual 4-barrel carburetors. Almost everyone in the industry, including Pontiac's own engineers, understood that the real output was significantly higher, likely well over 400 horsepower, deliberately underrated to avoid drawing attention from either the AMA or from insurance companies. The 421 Super Duty debuted on the drag strip weeks before it was ever formally announced to the public, driven by legendary racer Hayden Proffitt in a car prepared by Mickey Thompson. It represented the direct evolution of Pontiac's 389 Super Duty program from the year before. And this exact engine family, quietly built and quietly sold throughout the early 1960s, would eventually feed directly into the 389 that powered the Pontiac GTO just 3 years later. Detroit wasn't supposed to be building race cars in 1961. Pontiac built one anyway, gave it a deliberately modest horsepower number, and sold it right off the showroom floor to anyone who knew exactly what to ask for. And that brings us to number 1. The fastest and least hidden American production car of 1961, the Chrysler 300G. Nicknamed the banker's hot rod by period road testers, the 300G carried forward the 413 cubic inch cross-ram V8 from the year before, factory rated at 375 horsepower and 495 pound-feet of torque, with a rare solid lifter short ram option pushing output to 400 horsepower. Car Life magazine clocked the standard 300G from 0 to 60 in 8.4 seconds, running the quarter mile in 16.2 seconds at over 87 miles an hour, with a reported top speed of 131 miles an hour. At Daytona Beach, a 300G equipped with an optional 2.93-to-1 rear axle won the NASCAR Flying Mile Championship with a two-way average speed of 143 miles an hour, a genuine publicly celebrated racing victory, even in a year when the industry was supposedly staying out of racing entirely. Just 1,617 examples were built for the entire model year, including 337 convertibles. And 1961 marked the final year of the dramatic tail fin styling that had defined the letter series Chrysler since the mid-1950s. Fast, rare, and unapologetically loud about its own speed, the 1961 Chrysler 300G earned the top spot on this list, proof that at least one manufacturer in Detroit wasn't interested in hiding anything at all. So what did all of this actually prove? That the AMA racing ban never really stopped Detroit's engineers. It just taught them how to build fast cars quietly. Pontiac learned to underrate its own horsepower on purpose. Ford learned to ship race parts in the trunk instead of the engine bay. Chevrolet built one of the most legendary engines in American history and barely told anyone it existed, letting word of mouth and eventually a rock and roll song do the advertising instead. And underneath all of it, one of Detroit's oldest brands disappeared so quietly that most of the country never noticed DeSoto was gone until it already had been for months. The muscle car era did not appear out of nowhere in 1964. It was built slowly, one deliberately underrated engine at a time. And 1961 proved that Detroit's engineers were still racing each other just as hard as ever, even in a year when they were officially supposed to have stopped. Which 1961 American car would you bring back if you could only choose one? The openly fast Chrysler 300G? The secretly underrated Pontiac Super Duty 421, or the quietly hidden Chevy 409. Did your father, your uncle, or a neighbor on your street own one of these cars? Write the name in the comments below.